This is the Open Source Entrepreneur Network podcast with me, your host, John Mark Walker. Our guest today is Jono Bacon, whom I've known for many years. Jono is a man of many talents. He's written the book, The Art of Community. He has started the conference, the Community Leadership Summit, which is coming up this weekend in Austin, Texas, May 6th and 7th. And he recently started his own foray into consulting, Jono Bacon Consulting. Without further ado, I give you Jono Bacon in conversation recorded on March 31st, 2017. All right, so we're live. We are right now streaming to a private broadcast so that nobody else can see it. So that if you say anything incriminating, I can either delete it or just use it to embarrass you in the future. So just keep that in mind.
You're a terrible person.
I try.
We all knew that, though.
So, all right. So, yes, welcome. We're live with the Open Source Entrepreneur podcast. I'm here with Jono Bacon, the entrepreneur of entrepreneurs. Hi, Jono. So who are you and why should we care?
I'm no one and no one should care. It's the short answer to that.
Now. Modesty does not suit you.
No, it really, it's all fake. I guess, my background is in building communities. I spent some time at Canonical building out the Ubuntu community, some time at GitHub, at XPRIZE. And these days, I'm a consultant. I run my own consulting practice where I basically work with companies to build, either external communities of, developers or support communities or user communities, or also internal communities like inside of banks and larger organizations, that kind of thing.
That sounds actually very intriguing. And not to mention you were you started Community Leadership Summit. You wrote a book, The Art of Community. So just let's not tamp down your accomplishments.
I'll always remember when I first learned about communities back in 1998, I think it was, and I just was captivated by the idea of it. So it's been a bit of a lifelong kind of learning journey, and I feel like I'm still only scraping the surface of what we can learn. What
captivated you exactly? Like, why did you find it to be so intriguing?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think I've always just been, I think there was always like a nascent interest in people working together and how people kind of engage. I guess you could say that I've always been more of a people person than necessarily, other things. And I basically got this book, which was, about, an introduction to Linux. And the technology piece was fascinating to me because at the time, the idea of collaborating with people online was just, that didn't exist in my life at that point. Like, it didn't really exist in a lot of people's lives at that point because it was
I can tell you when I first started, but 1998, about the same time, because I felt like it was the first time that I thought, wow, I can be anything I want to be within the context of these communities, the Linux community, certainly at the time. Yeah. But up to that point, everything was, you've got this long path ahead of you and you have to like cross each milepost and set way to do it. And there's no kind of variation from, the right way to do it, so-called. But this allowed me kind of the freedom of thought and movement that, up until that point, I did not come across. So it was...
I think it was transformative. I was actually thinking about this yesterday. I was working with a client and I was just thinking, I feel so fortunate for many different reasons, but for being involved at that time because, I was an 18-year-old kid living in England with long hair, believe it or not.
I've seen pictures.
And I didn't really, I didn't grow up in Silicon Valley. I didn't grow up in an area where that kind of stuff existed. Right. And it was incredibly empowering. And it was, the community element to me was that connective tissue between technology and how people think and operate in a human way, like not there's a lot of people who say, well, you can lead people by building out process, and you basically build an effective process and then people are expected to follow it. That's just not how humans tend to think. So you've got to build something that fits the psychology of your audience. And that to me is fascinating. Like I say, it's weird because when I was at Canonical, I had a little bit of ego told me that I kind of figured this stuff out. I've written the book, I've done a conference. And then when I left Canonical, and particularly when I started consulting, I was like, holy crap, there's so much I don't know about this. This journey is way longer than expected.
You went from, I'm Jono Bacon, you respect my authority, to,
I mean, I'm not sure if anyone should have ever respected my authority, but there was definitely like, I'm embarrassed to admit it. Like I honestly thought, I didn't think I was brilliant at this, but I thought I had the hang of it. And then when I really started diversifying the work, working with lots of different people, I was like, Jesus, there is just, I think I've got the hang of it to a degree, but I realized, it's kind of like you're playing a video game and you pass the first boss, and then you realize there's 600 more bosses to pass, and you're like, okay, there's a lot to this journey for me.
I think we've all been at that point where we thought we knew everything, and then we got our ass handed to us, and we're like, oh, okay, I guess not. It's a journey. It's a continuous journey.
It is, and that's one of the things I find so rewarding about it is I'll be in meetings or I'll be just chatting to people, and someone will say something. It can be like a sentence, and it will completely reshape my thinking. And that to me is the thrill of it. There's this kind of cliche of embracing failure, or all this kind of stuff that Tony Robbins type people talk about. But those people. But it's true. Like. The greatest insights have often come from times when you got it wrong, and I love that. That's fun.
And it's honestly, so if I could just minor detour just for a bit here, I have to say, watching how children process failure is very illuminating, especially as they go through the and you'll probably see this later as they go through the educational process. And how they're taught to handle it, and as a parent, I'm concerned that we don't teach children the right way to to process failure. It's kind of, I guess it's up to us parents to really make sure that they get that right message. But I agree with you. It's funny, like my parents, when I said I feel pretty fortunate. One of the things I feel very fortunate by is my parents were always very supportive as a kid. I know a lot of people sadly don't have that luxury. And and one of the things that my dad in particular always instilled in me was, that there's a creative solution to every problem. And I think, it's actually one of the things I've been thinking about recently is like wrestling with adversity is so important to try and teach people and to learn. And no one ever gets training for it. That's one of the things I've been thinking about recently. It's like, that's for sure.
Class at school with dealing with adversity, and some people deal with adversity in health or in families or in careers or whatever it might be. And there should be more support for that kind of thing, because I think it's dealing with adversity that really helps people to kind of build that confidence that you can kind of keep growing and learning and all that.
That's for sure. Someday we'll have to do a separate podcast all about how managing communities is just like parenting. But anyway.
Yes. Let's do that.
All right, we'll set it up. So back, in the halcyon days of 1988, when communities were entirely community governed and kind of ad hoc and just kind of coming online, now we're getting to the point where companies are very, very interested in communities. What do you think some of the biggest challenges companies face when they say, "Oh, we want to do this community thing"? What are some common pitfalls that
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a few things that feed into this. One of the things I think, particularly as companies have been, particularly technology companies who are exploring things like open source methodologies and principles, is that they think it's all about code, whereas in reality, it's really more about culture. And I think embracing community. So, as an example, one of my clients is a big bank based in the UK. Yeah, and we're building out an internal community in there, and they're doing a fantastic job, because it's that to me, it's like that mixture of, you need to build a permissive environment, so therefore it requires some top down. You need leadership, particularly in those kinds of command and control environments. You need leadership to be able to state that this is something that's important for us to pursue, and we think this is good for the company, et cetera, et cetera. But then you need that bottom up kind of real stuff that people can grab onto. Because I think that kind of cultural change is difficult and weird for a lot of companies, particularly bigger companies.
What are some of the doozies that you've seen them?
One of my favorites is where there'll be an executive, typically like a senior exec will say, we need to kind of move towards this new culture, this new way of doing things.
Right.
They'll put a tiger team on it to put together some kind of machine that will be the new way of working. And then they basically say, like, this is important culturally for us, and we're going to make this move. And then they basically mandate it on people. They basically shove it down people's throats. And that just doesn't work, because I think people most people are pretty resistant to change. And the adaptive process, I think, is one of the most critical elements here. It's that, like, there is like a cliche in management that if you make your executive or your manager feel like it was their idea, then you're more likely to succeed. I think it's the same thing with cultural adaptation. Is when the audience that you're working with feel like it's just kind of like a natural change, like a natural fit. Like I made the decision to kind of adapt to this new culture. Then you succeed. Like, shoving it down people's throats really doesn't work. And that is, I think, for a lot of companies, particularly those command and control companies, really bizarre concept to rock.
No, you're absolutely right. And culture change is really, really hard. I mean, even though it might be completely necessary, going down, I mean, you're talking about changing the way people think, and that's not an easy path to go down. And honestly, I don't know what the best path to do that is, because it can't just be some unfunded mandate from up high. There has to be buy-in from everyone, from the people on the front lines to middle management to and let's be honest, in a lot of environments, they get these executive mandates like at least twice a year. So people are kind of accustomed to tuning them out and just kind of like waiting around until things shift back. So I don't know if there's any easy answer to that, but it's an endemic problem, it seems to be.
I think part of it as well is I think it's like a lot of things. If you want to pursue something new, you want to make a good change. I think you've also got to be brutally honest with yourself, and in this case with your organization, about what the contributing factors are. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a different bank a while back. And one of the things that was interesting with them was there was a very clear kind of financial motivator in staff. So it was, people were well paid and they had large bonuses, and a distinct bonus pool. And one of the things that this one guy at this offsite that we had was just brutally honest with me about how the company worked, and I loved it. And him and I actually became really good friends. And one of the things that he said to me was, like, one of the things you're going to have to wrestle with here is people will not collaborate for fear of losing their bonuses. So they're like, I don't want to give the other person in the organization, it was such a competitive organization, I don't want to give the other person the competitive upper hand, because A, that might impact my reputation, and B, that might then impact my bonus. So it was like the antithesis of a typical open source community, where you build social capital and you build out your reputation, that kind of like meritocratic model. Whereas in that environment, it was quite the opposite. So what we had to do was adjust, we had to essentially, protect people's bonuses in the typical kind of manner, and then introduce essentially new incentives that were financial incentives that would motivate the right kind of behavior. And I think unless that guy had given me that feedback, we would never have done that. So like being just, and that again is an awkward conversation when you talk to like a CEO, particularly founders. I mean, CEOs, that's different. But like founders, it's an emotional experience being frank with some random dude who comes in to try and help fix these things.
But I mean, but in that case, don't you think maybe because you're coming at it from an outsider's perspective, that you're kind of given more weight than your typical
Right.
line employee that would never be that frank with the CEO. I mean,
that is one of the, I think one of the most valuable tools in the toolbox of a consultant is
right.
you can have conversations. Like you're being hired to have an impact, and you're being hired because of your reputation. It's not like if you're an employee in a company, there's just a whole set of politics that you're part of.
Right.
But the balance has to be struck, right? Because if you're too frank with the company, then it can cause resistance. Like the body will reject the antibiotic. And I think that to me is one of the most interesting elements. One of the things I enjoy the most is that political component. But yeah, I think being, there are many situations where with my clients where, particularly with those more political kind of organizations, where I have to play that card very carefully.
Yeah.
And in many cases, I'll have like the counterparts in the company will reach out to me and say, like, we're trying to accomplish this thing, but we can't accomplish this with our current political capital. And but that's a card that's a card I can only play every so often. Like, you can't go nuclear.
No, that's not a good way to protect your job.
Right.
Yeah. So when you look at the rising importance, as everyone has come online, and we conduct business on the internet, turning more to, I guess, external communities.
Yeah.
Do you see, when you look at building community internally versus externally, what are some of the key differences there? Are there fundamentally differences, or are they really kind of the same?
My theory here is it's the same the same kind of social science, but a different set of psychological and workflow principles. So,
interesting. Okay.
So for example, with an external community, the example I just gave of the guy with the bonuses, for example, that works very different in an external community.
Yes.
The motivator is rarely financial. The motivator is often, it's more of like one of those intrinsic rewards around feeling that sense of belonging or feeling part of something. So reputation and respect is a major driver, I think, for a lot of people in external communities. So I think those like incentives, those methods of engagement do vary. And even then, in different types of external communities, I think you get different drivers, right? So, with open source, for example, there is a big difference between volunteer open source projects and like professionally driven. Like, there's a huge difference between Kubernetes and KDE, for example.
Yes, that's for sure.
The type of developers, the type of participation varies. So, but I think a lot of the core principles. I mean, look, I think we're animals, and some more than others. And
right,
we're animals, and it's just animals engaging with each other and finding common ground. And that sounded really
right. Or as I like to say, did we pass the butt sniffing test? And then once we, but
I've never heard that.
Anyway, I'm careful with whom I use that analogy. So yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, so you're meeting with a client, and Mr. Executive comes up and says, "How do I justify this cost? You're telling me I should do this and this and this. That costs money. Changing process costs money. Inculcating a new culture costs a whole lot of money and time and effort. Tell me what the cost justification is for this."
Right. Yeah. I mean, the rational. It's interesting because typically when I come in, they've already made that decision. They're like,
okay.
We're justifying hiring this consultant, and we already see the value in this. Although that's typically, an individual or a small set of individuals. There's then the rest of the organization to convince.
Right.
And the way I try to approach this from a few different angles. One is telling the story of why this is valuable using examples from other organizations. Like if I go in there and just kumbaya my way to explaining why it is, it's just not going to work. So I'll talk about, the amazing community work going in places like OpenStack or Local Motors or Pokemon Go or Ingress, all of these different examples. But then to me, that's like almost like the foundation. That'll only get you so far.
Right.
The real value to me is those one-on-one conversations with those individuals or with those teams where I can identify what their drivers are and derive value specifically to their teams. So, one of the key things to me is like figuring out like, what is this person's motivation and what is this person's kind of agenda? And then how can I adjust this this strategy so it meets their agenda? So if they feel like, this is generally good for the company, community, kumbaya, but then I'm getting something specific out of this, then I think that ends up getting more and more people on board. That's one of the reasons why I find this really fun and interesting is it's chess, and which is probably a bad comparison because I'm really bad at chess.
Well,
it's Connect 4 or Connect 3, whatever that was.
Good analogy nonetheless. But when you so getting back to kind of like the cultural change aspect,
yep.
And you've got an organization, and they've come to the point where they know they need to make a change, or at least the higher ups in the org know they need to make a change. Do you recommend the wholesale change? Do you recommend starting with like the teams most amenable to it? I mean, how do you recommend people approach this?
The way in which I recommend it is to I think the first step is to make sure everybody's got the same cognitive model of what the problem is. This is really transformative. It's amazing how many people think they're solving the same problem, and they're actually radically different ideas.
That's a really good point. Yeah. How do you get them to agree to that? I guess is the first
right. One. And a lot of that is just agreement of what the problem is. People, that's usually not too difficult. And then what I like to do is to map that to a set of themes of like broad buckets of work. I call them the big rocks, which is naming stolen from my old boss at Canonical, Rick Spencer, who's now at Bitnami. And then what I like to do is to break down, like if you define those themes, to break that down into small cycles of work, and to emphasize like, let's try something for a month or 2 months. Let's experiment. We'll invest in a small way. We'll just make some bets and see what it looks like. When I started consulting, what I ended up doing was, I'd gather requirements, I'd understand what was going on, and then I'd write someone a big report with, prioritization so they could map that. And one of the things that I discovered from that was, people liked that at an academic level. Like they were like, wow, this is really comprehensive. I basically wrote them a book. But I think what people are more amenable to is something that, is very practical, something that is small that they can wrap their heads around. So it's difficult because I think people want that big vision, that big picture. Right. They want that guidance, particularly they want to hire a consultant for a small period of time and then have enough to move forward without depending on the consulting. I mean, that's my ultimate job is to eventually make me irrelevant to the company. It's like, they also need something that they can actually greenlight and get on with. So I feel like the key thing here is experimentation. Like, trying new things and seeing how it works.
I guess it depends on the audience of the work, right? I mean, I can see the higher level executive wanting the quote unquote executive view dashboard, but then, people actually doing the work, they're not going to, they will need a different view. So it's interesting how you kind of provide that to different levels depending on, where they are.
I think that's a great point, and the engagement and how it's broken down into different layers is important. Like to your point, like it's amazing to me. One of the things I like to tell people who are brand new in their career is, and this is often something they don't realize, but is something I learned, it took me too long to learn this, is the more executive somebody is in a company, the less time and information they want to process.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Anything more than 5 bullet points to senior people is too much.
That's right.
And the further down you go, the more time, the more focus, the more detail you want. And that I think that absolutely has to apply to this kind of stuff. So.
Absolutely. Very quickly, last question. Yeah. How much overlap do you see between what you do and kind of like the Scrum Masters, the people implementing the DevOps mentality or agile methodologies?
It's a good question. I think that kind of stuff is a component of what I recommend. So a big chunk of the approach that I take is agile. It's elements of Scrum. Right. It's components of Kanban. I find that with a lot of those kinds of people who trade in that, who consult in that, it's valuable work, because like companies get a lot of value out of that.
Right.
But often it's often disconnected from solving specific problems. So I tend to, my goal here is, I'm not advocating for any specific tool or methodology. It's like I'm not telling people to use GitHub or GitLab. I'm not telling people to use Agile. I'm not telling people to use Linux or Docker. My job is to kind of pull together the best of breed and to see what maps most to a company. And I think that Agile is definitely an important component of that. So
great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for stopping by, and look forward to what you've got in the future. And